This week we're going to be looking at some destruction work, and we're destroying this terrain here as this creature bursts up through it. So I've created this fracturing geometry object, so let's dive inside there. And let's object merge in the terrain. So drop in an object merge, point that to object / environment and out terrain. And we can check the attributes on this to see if it needs any cleanup, because as you're fracturing these meshes, any extra attributes that you have on there will need to be interpolated at the fracture cut lines and stored on all of the new points and primitives. And unnecessary attributes can really slow things down a lot, so it's just good to get in the habit of cleaning meshes up before you fracture them. In this case, it doesn't really matter too much, but I don't need that mask attribute anymore at this point, so I'll go ahead and clean up that. And this mesh is quite large. It's almost 500 units across, and whenever I'm doing fracturing and simulation, I try to keep this within a more reasonable numeric range. This is probably fine to fracture at this scale, but I'm just going to turn it down to a smaller sim scale just in case. We'll just drop in a transform SOP and call this sim scale, and let's try a scale of 0.3. That makes this terrain here a little bit more than 100 units across, and when we carve out a specific area, that's going to be significantly smaller, so this should be a decent numeric range to work in. And let's also bring in the creature for reference to see where we need to add our fracture detail. So I'll just object merge in that creature, point this to object / creature flying simulated, and out squid 3. Let's template display that. And I'm going to make a reference copy of my sim scale to put the creature in the same space. So right click on that transform, go to actions, create reference copy, and drop that underneath this imported creature. Let's display both that and our mesh here. So we have the creature placement for reference, and I always encourage people to not fracture any more of an object than they really need to. The larger the section that you fracture, the less detail you'll be able to push in there before it starts to get a bit too heavy for your computer to process. So keeping things defined to just the area you're really interested in will make it a lot easier to work with and allow you to increase the overall detail a bit more. So let's generate an area of interest here. I'm just going to create a sphere and place that in that region right around that creature there. And we don't really want to do a perfect spherical cutout here. Let's add a bit of noise to this. So I'll drop in a mountain SOP. Let's increase that height quite a bit. And of course, template display that so we can see it. And this is super high frequency right now, so let's turn up the element size as well. And this is looking pretty good. Those are some decent natural looking shapes. This will be a nice region to cut out to do a more detailed fracture. And now to cut out this area of interest, let's drop in the Boolean fracture SOP. That's the Boolean fracture, not the standard Boolean. So drop that in here, connect the terrain to the first input, the noisy sphere to the second. And this Boolean fracture SOP allows us to treat the input geometry as either a solid or a surface. And you might think that we want to fracture this as a surface because that's what our input terrain is. This is just planar geometry without any solid thickness. And sometimes when you fracture planar geometry like this as a solid, it can potentially do some weird things. And surface fractures are much faster, but in this case, we actually want to get these inside faces of the sphere to be represented in the fracture output. So even though this is a surface input, we can get some interesting results by leaving this set to solid. And it's also worth noting that this detriangulate option will often need to be set to no polygons or only unchanged polygons. when you're doing additional fracturing processes later. When the Boolean fracture does its processing, it actually turns the mesh into triangles. This is all made of quads right now, but in that Boolean processing, they all get triangulated, and then this detriangulation turns them back into quads afterwards. And oftentimes this is what you want because it will give you a cleaner and somewhat more lightweight output from the Boolean process. But even though this detriangulation cleanup can be pretty nice, it can cause some little issues in the mesh that won't be visually obvious, but they can cause some incorrect results from later fracturing processes. So if you run into issues with your fractures after you've done some initial cuts, then go back and turn off detriangulation for all of your initial cuts. But in this case, I didn't find it to be a problem, and this is a very simplistic first fracture, so I'm going to try leaving that on to start. And after running this Boolean fracture, it doesn't look much different than it did before because it is a very clean fracture. But you can see we have this fracture seam line there. And if we look underneath, then you can see that the cutter sphere is represented as well because we fractured this as if it were a solid object. So this is all working correctly. However, you can see that the sphere surface is a bit jagged. This is perhaps a bit more obvious if we set this to smooth shaded. And this is looking, quite jagged, doesn't look very nice. And you could potentially address this by smoothing out the cutter sphere, but we have another option as well on the Boolean fracture itself. We have interior and exterior normal cusp angles, and the interior angle of 15 is fairly low. That's going to give us a lot of these hard edges that you see here. So we can really smooth this out quite a bit by raising that interior cusp angle. So I'm going to try setting this to 60. And you can see that really smoothed out these shapes underneath that terrain quite a bit. And there are still some little problem spots in here. In this case, I'm really not worried about it too much because I don't think we're going to really see any of these little jagged spots here. You could work on cleaning this up a bit with the original sphere cutter object. That's one option. But whenever we're doing effects work, it's not really worth spending time on things we're never going to see. And there's going to be a whole bunch of cool fracturing happening above the ground here, and dust and debris, so I don't think we're going to notice a couple of these little sharp normals on the inside of that sphere there. So now let's drop in a file cache for this initial cut here. Ultimately, we want to take this cutout region here and do some more detailed fracturing on it, but the rest of the terrain is going to be passed directly to our render object, and we don't want this to refracture every time we reopen the scene. We always want to just pull this from the cache directly. So on this cache here, I'm going to call this destruction, cutout, and I'll turn this up to version 2. We'll just save the current frame, make sure load from disk is on, and save that to disk. And now we can split out the section that we want to fracture. So let's hit S for our selection mode. Make sure we're selecting primitives, and we're going to select primitives based on their name. So you can use this icon here to select groups of primitives based on an attribute, or you can just hit the number 9 to bring up that option as well. And then if we go to the gear icon here and down to attributes, we can select based on this name attribute, or you can just click it in the list here. And now in the viewport, you can see that we're able to pick our primitives based on the unique name. So I'm just going to select this fractured cutout area there and tab in the viewport and type split. So this just gives us that region that we've cut out with our noisy sphere. And then the second output of the split, we can just send the rest of the terrain to the render object. So let's drop in a null for that second output from the split. We'll display that. And this is going to just be the static region. So I'll call this out, static region. And currently this is at sim space, not our final rendering space. So let's create a reference copy of our sim scale once again. So just right click on that, actions, and create reference copy. Let's drop this underneath our out static region here. And we don't want to scale this down again to make it even smaller. We want to scroll down on this reference copy of the sim scale, and we're going to invert this. I'm actually going to rename this to sim scale invert, and then Control Shift click on this invert transformation parameter, and then turn that on so that this reverses that simulation scale to put it back in the correct space for our final rendering camera. And then now that we have this in our correct rendering space, let's drop in a null, and I'll call this render static region. And because we're going to be simulating some of the ground pieces here flying through space, we may need some rest data on all of this geometry to make sure any noises and such stick in the shader. So before we pass that to the render object, let's just add in a rest position here, and then we can jump out to the object level, go into our render env here, dive inside that render object, and instead of pointing this object merge to environment/out env, we can instead point this to the static region. However, if we just point this to the static region we just made, then we're going to lose the base of our environment here. So instead of just changing this object merge, let's, instead of pointing this to out env, point this to environment out base. That'll just give us that bottom base section only. Then we can drop in another object merge and point this to object/fracturing, and then render static region. And now we can just drop in a merge and merge the base with our static region of our fracture. So now with that render object updated, let's go back to our fracturing setup and then take a look at doing a more detailed fracture on this area of interest here.